and welcome to Gator Breakdown on SEC Breakdown. We bring in, of course, David Waters and myself hosting each and every week. So if you don't know about us on SEC Breakdown, it's myself and David, Chad Neepling, Mike Laval, heading up a project where we do nothing but talk SEC football nonstop on Twitter, on Facebook. Join us on SEC Breakdown and on YouTube as well. So you might be watching us, you might be listening to the podcast, Gator Breakdown, and now we finally, Dave, can talk some football. We finally watched some football this weekend. It was good to see with all the conjecture during the offseason. But on the night where Steve Spurrier was honored for the fun and gun offense and all that he did for Florida football, not necessarily a lot of fun and gun out there in a 24-7 win over UMass.
Not at all. It looked like they tried to start with that. The very first play of the game was a attempted bomb to Antonio Callaway from Luke Del Rio that fell incomplete. But it looked like they did. We're definitely trying to get the high flying attack Spurrier was known for on that very first play. Yes, it was a restless night in the swamp. It was a clunky night. It seemed like every time Florida did something good, something bad would happen. It was a one step forward, two steps back type of game. Maybe even a lot of experimentation going on. What was there with you're getting a lot of true freshmen. 11 true freshmen got playing time last night. So you could tell, Florida was trying to work on some stuff, but also a lot to be worked on just because of in places they should have dominated. No matter what they were trying, they didn't. So we'll see how this team moves forward in a very lackluster performance in the season opener.
We can go a number of directions on this day, but obviously Luke Del Rio playing his first game at Florida is a way to look at this. With throwing 44 passes, so trying to work on the passing game and in preparation for SEC play coming very soon. Your thoughts about his performance?
Mark, I didn't like the fact that he had 44 attempts. Like you said, it was probably him trying to work on getting him, some more attempts going into SEC play with Kentucky next week. But to me, I didn't like the game plan. UMass, the DBs played off of the Florida receivers all night, daring Luke Del Rio to throw underneath, and that's exactly what he did. He was known as a quarterback that would take what the defense gives him, maybe not test, the depth of field, not throwing deep passes, and that's exactly what happened. We were worried that he was timid throwing downfield, and that's exactly what it looked like last night. Besides the first play of the game, the offensive line didn't do him any favors. I think that probably also played a part in it. He was running a good bit while the tackle was Sharp. Even though Sharp was experienced, he didn't look too great last night. Fred Johnson on the right side, we were worried about him going in. He didn't look so great either. And the inside as well. There was a lot of pressure up the middle. So the Florida offensive line did not do Luke Del Rio any favors last night. But Del Rio did a good job in spreading the ball out. Plenty of receivers and freshman receivers got involved. Running backs caught passes, like I said, the tight ends. So Del Rio did a good job of spreading the ball out. But I didn't really care, like I said, for the game plan. I don't think Luke Del Rio should be throwing 44 times a game when the run game was kind of actually working early on in the game. So we'll see what happens moving forward. Like I said, I think a loss last night against UMass was a lot of experimentation, getting young guys on the field, but it was that offensive line that kept getting beat as a worry sign moving forward.
So we can't expect miracles. You can't overhaul the offensive line from a personnel standpoint from one season to another, besides what you get in the recruiting class. So the offensive line, though, it's going to be the coaching staff's call and the offensive line coach to obviously develop this group and fix some things very quickly with some really good teams coming up soon. So how much can we expect there, though? Because we went an entire season last year with it being maybe a little bit better than we expected, because we expected maybe near disaster, and it was decent at times, but maybe there wasn't the improvement in game one against an inferior foe that we anticipated.
That's pretty much what it was. I think the Florida fans are a little frustrated because it was a lot of what we've seen last year. You're right. It didn't look better from last year. Fred Johnson at right tackle looked at times like he didn't even belong on the field versus an overmatched opponent. Florida brings in Jawan Taylor at right tackle, a true freshman, run right behind him 2 plays in a row, and some positive things happen there. So look for Jawan Taylor to maybe. I mean, I hate to say that we can glean too much from one game, but look for Jawan Taylor to get some more playing time next week against Kentucky, and him and Fred Johnson rotate. Maybe Jawan Taylor even starts. Maybe it's too much to take from game one, but that offensive line just really got taken advantage of by an overmatched opponent, and maybe they played down to their competition. McElwain mentioned in his press conference that they were just slow like Sedazo. They didn't rush up to the line. It just looked like they really didn't want to be there. And, for a position group that had a lot of questions coming in, you would think they'd want to silence some of the doubters, but they didn't do anything but raise more questions.
Got to join David, myself, Chad Niebling, Mike Laval on SEC Breakdown, and this is our Florida podcast, Gator Breakdown, but we are quickly filling up the SEC with team-specific podcasts. Join us on YouTube, SEC Breakdown, also Twitter and Facebook. We talked a lot about it, Dave, during the offseason in regards to the running back distribution. Who's going to get the carries? Who's going to get the workload? So do you make anything out of Jordan Scarlett with 13 attempts, Mark Thompson with 6, Jordan Cronkrite with 3?
I thought that not one running back was able to get hot. Jordan Scarlett did start the game. He looked good pretty early in the game. But on the first drive first couple of drives, we saw every one of these guys in, and even true freshman LaMichael Pirine, who on his very first carry fumbled. Gators were lucky to recover, but it was just another player, new true freshman, getting some time in, but he didn't look good doing it so far. So Scarlett getting the majority of the carries is not too surprising, given how he was playing and what we heard going into this game. That he maybe the switch is flipped, but going back again, the offensive line didn't give them many running lanes. Scarlett looked like Kelvin Taylor did a bit last year in making defenders miss just to get some yards. Later in the game, once the Florida depth just kind of took over in the fourth quarter, Scarlett had some good tough runs to help put the game away, and Mark Thompson as well. But it was just like I said, the offense was clunky. The drives, even though they took a lot of time up, and it just didn't necessarily drop passes, and just it was very. I keep saying clunky performance because that's exactly what it was. I expected to see a smooth performance with Luke Del Rio. The offense kind of trying to silence some doubters, but even with the running backs, it just seemed, and it wasn't necessarily on them. I do think it was more the offensive line affecting the entire offense. And so it didn't matter who they put back there. I think they would have had some success with the offensive line being able to block better. But Jordan Scarlett, I did look for him to get more carries moving forward. I like the way his tough running just kind of took over at points in the game yesterday. And I think the running backs in general all should have got more carries. Luke Del Rio shouldn't have had his 44 attempts, and those running backs should have had a lot more of those.
Clunky was kind of the word that got thrown around for a number of teams in the SEC over the weekend.
Very much so, very much.
Though, I would love to see statistics on this when a top 25 team, especially from the SEC, takes on a group of 5 team that's a lesser group of 5. What kind of running production should you expect? Out of 29 attempts out of the running game, only 1 for 11 yards. That was the longest run, so nothing got broken downfield for any kind of huge plays out of the running game, and it was pretty much a grinded out. Like the yards per carry wasn't horrible, and Scarlett was at 5.4, but just nothing past 5-6 yards. Right,
and Florida has the bigger backs, and you shouldn't necessarily expect home runs from them every great now and then. But you're right, Mark. 11 yards should not be the longest carry from of traditional SEC power going against a group of 5 school who won 3 games last year. You would expect Florida to come in and dominate at certain points in the game, but the offensive line didn't give the running backs any lanes to do it. It was the running backs doing a lot of it themselves. So it was a lot of tough running into crowds and trying to get something out of that. But I do think Florida should have run the ball more. Maybe some of those home runs could have came if Florida ran the ball more. So it was. More of it was experimentation. I think they wanted to see what they had all over the field and not just certain points of the field. Wanted to see what they had with Luke Del Rio and get him some experience with the receivers. But I think to help Luke Del Rio and what that UMass defense was giving him and playing off the receivers, you know what? The running game would have helped that. Give the running back some carries, draw those defenders up in a box, and then go over the top of them. I think that would have helped the overall offense so much. So, but I'm not a coach. I'm sure they were working on something they wanted to see some, some certain situations of what this offense can handle. But I don't think the offense did a good job in handling those situations.
Yeah, before we touch on the defense, Del Rio went to the guys that we expected: Brandon Powell, Antonio Callaway with 15 catches between them. Josh Hammond chipped in with 5 receptions, and I know that Florida fans have been waiting to see what he's got.
Yeah, Mark, and we'll talk about these receivers. And before we dive into it, I think we have to mention Dre Massey has come down right before we started this. Dre Massey will now be out for the season for the Gators. Pat Dooley reports from Gainesville Sun. Dre Massey was going to be a big part of this offense. He kind of seemed to be the most consistent receiver in fall camp. He returned the opening kickoff last night in the game, and we didn't see much from him after that. He came in a couple of times, but I think they probably wanted to see what was going on with him. He came back, and we didn't see him. He came back on the bench, and we didn't see him anymore. And we wondered all night, and through the morning, if we would hear anything today. And we get that news from Pat Dooley that Dre Massey would be out for the year. So these young receivers, Josh Hammond, Freddie Swain, that we did see catch some passes against UMass, will now be an even bigger part in this offense. Freddie Swain will be more that slot receiver along with Brandon Powell that Massey that Massey was going to play. So I think we'll see Swain, some more in the slot with Brandon Powell. Hammond was the first freshman to catch a pass for the 2016 Gators last night. So his little brother of Frankie Hammond, former Gator receiver. So he's got a name there for Gator fans that we definitely want to keep an eye on. But Antonio Callaway seemed to be the main target last night for Del Rio. Can't blame him there. But didn't really, really break the big play we expect to see from Callaway. Had the first touchdown pass on a wide open, busted coverage from UMass. So good for Luke Del Rio finding that and getting the touchdown there. Brandon Powell with a long reception for a touchdown, a run after the catch there. Showing his ability to do that again. So, a far cry from what Florida was able to do last year at receiver. There's many more names. These freshmen are much deeper than what they were last year. They can rely on a couple of freshmen to help carry the receiving core. The ball is spread around. Plenty. Young guys got experience. That's exactly what you want to see in games like this. Without the score would be a bit bigger when these young guys are in there getting more experience. But with Luke Del Rio throwing the ball 44 times and 29 completions, and a lot of these receivers were on the end of those 29 completions.
Yeah, the UMass offensive numbers are pretty much what you would expect against a Florida defense. 7 points, 12 first downs, 1.3 yards per carry, only 187 total yards. But anything that you saw to the defense that raises any kind of concern?
I do with some of the young guys. Chris Williamson got to come in with Jalen Tabor being suspended. Dawson went down with an injury, so Florida had to rely on some of these young guys to help carry the banner. And Chris Williamson got beat on a double move on a long completion for UMass. That yes, he doesn't have a lot of experience, but you expect DBs at Florida not to to be like that. Yes, it's game one. He doesn't have a lot of experience. Things like that may happen. Don't want to overreact there. But after that, pretty much, Chauncey Gardner got some good playing time on the outside and helped cover receivers. Joseph Putu, was seen a good bit in the second half. So it seemed that they shored those long plays up a good bit. So that was good to see some of those young guys getting experience in the defensive backfield. We did hear along the injury front when we heard Dre Massey that Duke Dawson also should be back. He tweeted that he's all good, so he'll be back versus Kentucky. They get Jalen Tabor back. So, as long as the starters are there, some of those young guys can just fill in, and not have such a big, reliable roles that they had against UMass. I was kind of surprised with we didn't really hear C.C. Jefferson, Caleb Brantley, the guys on the defensive front, that the names we expect to hear. But, Mark, we did hear, and I was excited to hear, we did hear Jabari Zuniga's name a good bit. 4 tackles, 2 sacks. I called him out as one of my players to watch out for, and he showed up for game one. The redshirt year was probably a good thing for him, get adjusted to the game. He showed up last night against UMass. But also Jared Davis, and finally Alex Anzalone stayed healthy, and he was all over the field last night. The biggest thing, most disappointing thing I saw from the defense last night, it was the leaders getting penalties, senseless penalties. Jared Davis was roughing the passer. He knows better. He's a leader on this defense, and sitting there and hitting quarterback's leg was pretty lucky where the referees didn't call a targeting call on him later in the game when the quarterback was on the ground. He kind of dove back into him. Joey Ivy got on that same play. Another senior was also called for roughing the passer. So it was, Florida defense did more in aiding UMass's offense than UMass's offense actually helping himself. It was a Florida defense that gave UMass some breaks there to score their only touchdown of the game. So it's just cleaning up senseless penalties, getting those secondary guys, the younger guys, some more experience in game time. But overall, you can't complain what you saw from the defense. They're going to be fine once they get Jalen Tabor back, and those young guys can be more secondary roles instead of the starting roles.
I don't know where you're watching the game, Dave, so I can picture you sitting at home, maybe joining everybody else at the Swamp, chanting "Eddie, Eddie, Eddie."
Yeah, it was funny. I was with some friends. We throw a college football, party every opening weekend, and I made it a point when I knew Pinero came in. If he kicks this field goal, I'm going to overreact just for a funny reaction. So. He makes it. I scream, "Yeah, we made a field goal!" So there, yes, Eddie Pinero came in, 3 field goals, all of them over 40 yards, which is a far, far cry from what we saw last year, when even extra points couldn't be counted on to be made. Eddie Pinero, and good for him, was very excited in making these. He hasn't attempted a field goal kick in junior college or high school, so good for him for getting excited. He was kind of seemed like the only player last night who wanted to show any type of big time emotion as they kind of just sleptwalked through the UMass game. So good for him. Mark, he actually made 1 field goal early, and McElwain took it off the board after a UMass penalty and went and decided to go for it on 4th and 1, in which Florida did not get the 4th and 1. So Eddie Pinero's first field goal was taken off the board, but yeah, he came back and made 3 later on, all over 40 yards. Which was good to see. Something Florida fans can definitely count on. I'm just waiting for that one point when McElwain, maybe at the end of a half, if Florida's near midfield, lets him try one of his YouTube famous bomb kicks and see if he can nail one from about midfield somewhere, because I think it's coming. All
right, maybe it comes this week against Kentucky, so the Wildcats come in hurting. Wow, outscored 27-0 in the second half, leading Southern Miss. Drew Barker had his way in the first half with 4 touchdown passes, 323 total yards through the air. But, wow, Southern Miss comes back, 44-35 victory in Lexington. So 29 straight. Of course, you can't look past anybody. Kentucky's piled up a couple consecutive top 25 recruiting classes. So there's talent on this roster past what we see, I think, with Vandy and South Carolina, but I don't know if it's necessarily together at this point. Quick thoughts about Kentucky, obviously. I know you haven't surveyed the team too much, but in looking at the Wildcats.
Mark, I can kind of go off, when we did our season previews and when we kind of predicted the order of finish, how I wasn't necessarily too high on Kentucky, and mostly because Mark Stoops, he's a defensive guy, and that defense just hasn't shown up, and they got obliterated in the second half of that game yesterday. They had no pass rush, and let Southern Miss come back and win. But it's going to be 2 teams who play next week in the Swamp. It's going to be 3:30 kickoff, Florida and national TV for Kentucky and Florida. Will be interesting to see. You mentioned the 29-game streak that Florida has over Kentucky. Can Drew Barker come in and expose some of this Gator defense? But it's a far cry from, I think, where Kentucky wanted to come in with this game after losing to Southern Miss. Florida has a lot to work on. There's a lot of things that, if this Florida offensive line doesn't show any better, I don't care who they play. It was a close game versus UMass. So, even though Kentucky lost to Southern Miss, if this Florida offensive line doesn't show up, it's going to have another close game feel, in front of the home crowd in the Swamp. So it will be interesting to see. Southern Miss I think they ran the ball pretty well against Kentucky. So it will be interesting to see if this Florida offensive line, I'll mention them, can open some running lanes for these running backs. I don't want to see Luke Del Rio throwing the ball 44 times. I don't think that's in Florida's best interest right now. If the Kentucky defense follows the UMass blueprint and plays off of these Florida receivers, Florida needs to get the running game going to help Luke Del Rio draw some of those defenders in. So, yeah, Florida-Kentucky is the first SEC game for Florida this year. Luke Del Rio's first conference game. So we'll see how these Gators come out after a disappointing game versus UMass.
Yeah, I don't think the Gators are going to get too scared by some of the stats I read. Yeah, Kentucky was able to put up the 35 in the first half against Southern Miss with Drew Barker going for 4 touchdowns and 323. But look at the flip side, what you alluded to. Southern Miss, if you take away the sack yardage, hit up Kentucky for about 300 yards rushing. So if the running game's going to get healthy and the offensive line's going to flex its muscles, this is the time to start.
Right, and it's going to have to be a big emphasis in practice. Like I said earlier, Michael Wayne mentioned that the offensive line was very lackadaisical on how they wanted to approach the game last night. So I think they're going to be challenged in practice all week to come off, fire off the ball. Do you help your team? You didn't answer any questions that the media, probably their own team had if this offensive line could take the next steps. Those questions still aren't answered, and maybe even look a little bit worse right now. So, show up, be a man, do your job and help this entire team, because, this Florida team can be pretty good, but it is going to depend. They have a serviceable quarterback. They got the playmakers now. That's not the problem anymore at Florida. This offensive line needed to be retooled, but it's also time for results there. So, are we taking too much from one game? The only reason I think that we aren't is because this is kind of a trend now. We saw how the Florida offensive line ended last season. It continued the first game into 2016. So, we'll look for that. Excited to see what happens all over the field. But they do have their work cut out for them only after week 1.
All right. It's Gator Breakdown on the SEC Breakdown Network. So this is the deal. We cover the entire league. Dave, myself, Chad Neepling, Mike Laval. This is our specific Florida podcast. Gator Breakdown, but join us for SEC Breakdown on YouTube, Twitter, and on Facebook. And catch Dave. Man, if you're a Florida fan, if you're an SEC fan, it's Gator Dave _SEC, and myself, Mark Rogers of MarkRogersTV, where we talk a lot of college football across the country. All right, Dave, good stuff, man. That's one win in the book. Hopefully 11 more for the boys in the swamp.
Mark, we saw what the SEC was able to do week 1, and it wasn't. It was a far cry from what they expected. So, even though Florida didn't look too good against UMass, there were other teams that either lost their games against what we thought to be overmatched opponents, or also had close games themselves. So, the SEC will be looking to rebound a good bit in week 2.
Yeah, with what happened to Tennessee on Thursday night, Mississippi State early in the day, there might have been some alarmists out there, but Texas A&M got the job done. Alabama, of course, obliterated USC, and Georgia with an impressive win over North Carolina in a big ACC-SEC matchup. So not the worst when it comes across the board. If you really look at SEC football, I don't think that the sky is falling. And Auburn even plays the number 2 team in the country, close within a score and some Hail Marys at the end. So I think the league's going to be just fine.
Yep, we'll see. Like I said, week 2 brings a lot more overmatched opponent games. So we'll see. If never overreaction here, but after the first week, you definitely have to say Georgia was the best looking team out of all the East teams. Had the toughest opponent probably, and come out with a win there. So Florida struggled against overmatched opponents, and Tennessee struggled against what we thought were overmatched opponents. So yeah, we'll look and see. It's only week 1. There's still many questions out there to be answered, but it's already setting up for a fun season.
All right, for David Waters, this is Mark Rogers. Thanks for joining us here on Gator Breakdown.